And welcome back to How It's Med, specifically the series MedTech Talks, where we chat with people who are shaping the future of medical innovation and healthcare. Today, we have with us Michael Fergusson. My name is Geoff. My co-host is Abdo. And the questions that we usually start with usually aim to probe a little bit into the stories of our guests. So, Michael, can you tell us a little bit about how you got, I guess, to Vancouver overall, and then a little bit of how that led you to Ayogo? We'll start from there.
I'm happy to do that. Then thanks.
Big question.
Yeah, it is a big question actually. And thanks for having me. Well, I was born in Jamaica just by sort of accident of history. My mom was living there and working with a teachers training college, and met my father there. I moved back here to Vancouver with her in the late 70s, just in time for the Whitecaps to win the soccer ball, which was a pretty big deal for me when I was a kid. I didn't understand that hockey thing at all, but
Come on.
I got the round ball you kick with your foot. I eventually learned that how important hockey is, and
Okay.
and developed a deep love for all things Canucks. Um,
Thank you. Thank
yeah,
you.
very important to note. And well, I think, my story, from my adulthood forward is kind of a bit of an eclectic one. So I am, I guess, what they used to call a self-made man, I suppose. I left high school early and in my late teens, and 15, I think, when I dropped out of high school, and traveled the world. Went back to Jamaica to live on a Rastafarian commune for a year when I was 16, to escape Expo 86 mostly. And when I came back, I spent a few years working as a musician, or trying to work as a musician. I met my wife on Earth Day 1990 in the Prince George bus station, and we got married a few years later. Around that time, I decided that probably music, while it was a lot of fun, was not the most stable career for a young man thinking of starting a family. And again, just pure luck happened to, I had a lot of ideas about what I wanted to do. My sort of dream was to build digitally controlled analog synthesizers as a kind of installation art in home studios. I taught myself programming, machine control systems, electronics, on this newfangled internet thing. And the web wasn't even really the dominant mode then. And I used Gopher to go to, university sites, Gopher sites. And the web was just starting. And I remember printing out a list of every single website in the world. It was like 15 pages long or something. I guess it would have been 1992 or something like that, 1991. And, I did a lot of interesting things, taught myself a bunch of stuff, but it turns out the most valuable thing of all was that I did it all on the internet, and people were just starting to get a sense that the internet was going to be important. And, that my career just kind of proceeded from there, really. One of my earliest jobs in technology was converting old dial-up style bulletin board systems to web-based discussion forums. And I got a reputation as somebody who knew how to program the internet, and sort of built my career on that basis.
That's fascinating. So basically, you have, I guess, as you said, an eclectic background, and you molded it into something that eventually focused on the internet overall. So what pushed you into the venture space? I guess that's the first step towards the health tech space, but the venture space first.
Yeah. So I brought you up to about, I guess, 1996 or 1997. And
I wasn't even born.
well, those were crazy, heady times. The first .com go around and everything was going nuts. And I ended up at a company called SoftQuad, which was, one of the founding members of the World Wide Web Consortium, and full of a bunch of very, very smart people. Bruce Sharp, who was the CTO there, whose PhD is in mathematical physics, like to recruit people who also had advanced degrees in absurdly difficult fields like that. And I just, I really had no business being there, a high school dropout as I was. But Bruce really gave me a chance to make my own way. And he said, look, you're a smart guy, the internet and using the internet and programming for it in a way that us ivory tower people have less experience with. Just walk around and go to meetings and see what you can do. And I ended up as a product manager there for Hot Metal Pro, and then later for their XML tools, XML product suite, and went to a lot of committee meetings, because one thing about getting your PhD is you learn to hate committee meetings, and apparently, and so I ended up going to a lot of W3C committee meetings and learning a lot about what people were not doing very well with the web at the time, which was making it so that ordinary people could use it. And that really just inspired me to start my first company, which was, developing web applications and websites that ordinary people could use. Interestingly, one of the first people who worked for me was Stuart Butterfield, who's the founder of Slack. He and I worked together in 98, 99. And we built the design lab for us at a company called communicate.com, which I managed to exit from just before the whole .com explosion, and managed to escape with enough money to only really need to start businesses of my own since then. And I just became really increasingly fascinated with the psychology of online systems and how our attention often drives our intention, not the other way around. When we imagine that we intend to do things, and so we pay attention to them. But in actual fact, we have very little control over our attention. Our attention is drawn to things, and it actually molds our intention. It molds our behavior. And online systems are especially good, increasingly good, at getting our attention, and manipulating our behavior and our intentions below the threshold of consciousness. And I became really fascinated with this effect, in the early 2000s, and decided to build companies to try to harness that to do well and to do good things. And in around 2008, I started a serious game studio with a couple of colleagues. That was I guess my fourth company. I skipped over some boring stuff. And then that eventually became Ayogo in around 2011, focused specifically on how we can help patients and clinicians collaborate together more effectively, and to help patients think of their healthcare as something that is really integrated in their life and not something that is just happening to them.
You have one of the most fascinating stories I've ever heard, honestly.
It's a couple of interesting things. If you're interested in structured information systems, I've got a whole bunch of patents around massively multi-user collaboration systems from the early 2000s, but I skipped over that. That's not healthcare related.
We can talk about that one later, but how did you get so technical? Like, I'm getting my second degree in engineering now, and like, even listening to this is just giving me a headache. Like, oh my God, how did you do all this?
Well, I think I said already a couple times about the role that luck plays. And I was just very, very lucky to be around some really, really smart people who are just very generous, very generous with their time, very generous with, their mentorship. I mean, Bruce Sharp, Dr. Sharp, was an incredibly important influence in my career. Just go around to meetings, Michael, and just figure it out. Like, you're smart, see what you can do, make a contribution, and don't be afraid to ask questions. And, all along the way, whether it was the engineering team at SoftQuad, or, I built a company in folding systems, and I got advice from, Stuart Butterfield and Paul Prescott, who's one of the people who worked on the original XML specification. They just were very generous and helped me, because I'm a generalist, really. And like a lot of generalists, I have this very horizontal skill set. I'm very good at integrating things from a bunch of different fields. I can think about user experience design. I know a little bit about engineering, enough to be dangerous. I know how to structure legal contracts a little bit, enough to be a businessman. So I know a little bit of a bunch of things, and that's really, really helpful. But unlike a lot of generalists, I'm not very T-shaped. I know a lot of people who have a very general skill set, but it's built on top of some pillar of deep expertise, whether it's medicine or engineering or some other field like that. But I'm just about as pure a generalist as you can get. And, that I think has forced me to be disciplined in a particular way, which is, just to remain humble about things. I am actually not an expert in anything at all. And so, virtually everybody I speak to has a deeper expertise than me in some area. And so I'm hungry and I'm curious, and I try to be disciplined about, listening to people and asking questions and, being humble, and just, I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just taking risks and taking chances and, and iterating as I go and trying to always do better than the last thing I did.
Play off that, and do you think being dash-shaped, as you're describing it, inherently has an advantage over being T-shaped?
Well, I think it's different, and in some ways it's an advantage, like any difference. It's in some ways it's a weakness. You wouldn't want me to be your chief technology officer, maybe, or your head of engineering, probably, or a chief medical officer. You wouldn't want me to take on those kinds of roles where you require a really deep background in some particular area. But I'm very good at integrating information from a bunch of different fields and synthesizing some new insight. I've always been very good at thinking, I think it was Arthur Schopenhauer's got one of my favorite quotes, right? It's not to think, it's not to see what nobody else sees, but it is to think what no one has yet thought about what everybody sees. So, I really love that quote. There's so many things to see, right? And, you can go around looking for entirely new things. That's one way to go about the world. And I think you can do really interesting things when you do that. But I really love the kind of entrepreneurialism that comes from sifting through the garbage heap. There's a bunch of things that people just didn't really care enough about, they decided that it wasn't important. They threw it away. They just didn't utilize it, and you can utilize it in a new way. There was a lot of, the early part of the web was just recognizing that this sort of what people were doing, wasting time. You say people were wasting time on the internet is not a waste, actually. That's a valuable resource that could be harvested, and all sorts of business models were built around harvesting that, wasted attention, that exhaust, that data exhaust, that attention exhaust. And in a similar way, just about every field has that, some underutilized resource that can be combined in some new way to make a new opportunity.
That's fascinating. So, with this, I guess, generalist approach to how you think about things overall, why did that lead you to pursue Ayogo with a focus on medicine? Because that's such a subspecialized field. That's very, very difficult to be a generalist.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the reason you just said it out loud, right? It's so full of specialists, right? Who you need to have those, right? So full of, where are the generalists? Who are the people that are integrating, technology and medicine and, experience design and behavioral economics and, they're the siloing in medicine is very powerful. It's obviously one of the reasons why it's difficult to operate as a generalist in healthcare, right? Because it is so strongly siloed, often for very good reasons, but it does present opportunities. And one of those opportunities is just, this is probably one of the ways in which I first encountered it. I just got super, super excited. We got approached by Diabetes Hands Foundation together with the Joslin Diabetes Center at Harvard and a pharma company called Boehringer Ingelheim. Wanted to do we'd done a bunch of online social games that were oriented around, helping people to, engage with difficult topics like environmental issues and various different things. And they approached us really early on in the life of the company when we were still a game studio and said, hey, maybe you can help us here. We've got, this diet and exercise program for people newly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, and we just can't get them to pay attention to it. They know that it will help them live longer. It might make the difference between, an amputation or not. We can say that all along, we just can't get anybody to actually do it. And maybe you could help us. And we thought, well, that's a really interesting problem. Let's go out and talk to people. because that's what generals do, right? We go and we have conversations and we try to figure out what's what. So, we talked to a bunch of, patients, we talked to a bunch of endocrinologists, diabetes educators, and we heard a bunch of interesting things. You'd speak to a clinician and you say, what is your goal for this patient, this newly diagnosed with type 2? You say, well, we got to get their hemoglobin A1C down below 7.2 or whatever their goal is, right? So they say it like that. And then you go and you ask the patient, like, what is your goal? What are you trying to do? And they say, well, I want to travel after I retire and not go into a diabetic coma in a foreign country. That's my goal. Well, it turns out that's literally the same goal. It is just stated in a different way. And they just couldn't talk to each other across this divide. If you come to them and say, well, look, this program of diet and exercise will get your hemoglobin A1C down, patients are like, well, that's what my doctor wants. Okay, maybe that's, for some people, that's powerful enough motivation. But if you say, look, this will help you travel when you retire and not be afraid. Well, that's something that people can really understand. And sometimes it's just about translating between the languages. And that was sort of one of the early insights that got us really, really excited about working in this space. The other one was an effect we noticed in that early game, which was that you'd think some of the early social games are oriented around people sort of making pledges, right? I'm going to, you go onto the internet and, onto the web, you say, I'm going to do this week. These are my goals. And you tell people about it. And people who project their goals onto the internet, it was thought this was a powerful effect to keep you accountable. What we noticed actually was kind of the opposite effect almost, which was that it wasn't people who posted the most, but the people who received the most messages from other people were the ones whose behavior was most likely to change. So it's actually incoming messages from our social network that influence our behavior. You're speaking in your own voice. You've heard your own voice. You know what you were saying. You've heard that before. But when someone speaks to you from outside, because we're social animals, we naturally start to orient ourselves to the external incoming messages. It seems that's how we theorized that was having the effect, but it was a clear effect. I mean, people who received more messages from other people. So we designed our social games to maximize the number of positive incoming messages from the social network to try to influence people's behavior. And that was one of our really early projects. And we've just sort of continued along that avenue ever since.
That's fascinating, because behavioral change is one of the most difficult things to do in medicine. And I think a huge majority, in my opinion, funding should be spent on preventing disease, which is, done by behavioral change rather than treating it after it actually occurs. Mm-hmm. But we've talked around what Ayogo has done in the past, as well as a little bit about what it aims to do, behavioral change in healthcare. Mm-hmm. What are some specific things, or what are the mission goals of Ayogo in the current age, in its current state?
Yeah, well, in the last few years in particular, we've been very focused on dynamic tailoring of interventions, so dynamically adaptive interventions. So each person lives inside a unique psychosocial decision-making context. Different things influence me as influence you, and I've had different childhood than you have maybe, or, different sorts of things, different kinds of social networks. Obviously, we have different demographics and different effects. So if you want to influence somebody, the more you know about them, the more that you can influence them. And so we are trying to build a system that uses psychosocial profiling. So there are some validated instruments that we can apply here that are actually quite useful, like perceived self-efficacy, very useful construct, depression, anxiety, there's validated instruments that we can apply there to understand what is influencing a person's emotional states and decision-making states, but also things like value surveys. The things that you value are different from the things that I value. Maybe you're very, very, faith-oriented and you care deeply about your church, or, maybe there's, you're family-oriented, or you want to travel, or you're deeply dedicated to your pets. These kinds of things can really influence our behavior, or certainly give us a language that we can use to speak to the person about what's important in a language that they will recognize. So gathering this data to build a profile of a person, and then to use those data to dynamically architect a user interface for them. We like to say we construct individualized choice architecture. So a next best action for each, or a set of next best actions to choose from for each person that's unique to them, based on their goals, their values, but also other things like how much disease state knowledge do they have? How comfortable are they with technical language? How well connected are they socially? And we can provide them with interventions that are most likely to be, personal, relevant, and timely for that person to change their behavior. And we've been focusing this work mostly in around renal diseases and that sort of cluster of comorbidities that go around chronic kidney disease, diabetes, and various other things, but mostly focused on the later stages of that condition when people are they're sort of moving from one stage to another, moving on to dialysis typically.
Most obvious roundabout from here is the ethical implications of Ayogo's work.
Yeah.
How have you considered that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I just think this is really the fundamental issue of our time almost, right? It was thought for a long time that the real danger of artificial intelligence was super smart AI, right? AI that was smarter than the smartest of us. And, we would get out of our control and enjoy these things. Well, it turns out the real danger is stupid AI. And, there's a lot of systems that get built whose job it is to manipulate our behavior below the threshold of consciousness. And it's given really, really, really stupid goals. It turns out that human beings are actually very easy to manipulate, as long as your goals for that manipulation are quite narrow. If all you want is to make me more emotionally activated in order to make me more predictable, it's actually a very simple algorithm to do that. And the AI that Twitter and Facebook and Google apply there is really stupid. It's not interested in better social outcomes. It's not interested in better health. It's not interested in any of those things. It's just interested in making us a more predictable clicker so that they can make more money for their advertising. And this is, I think, one of the biggest dangers to our society. We thought we were really sophisticated and difficult to manipulate, and it turns out we're really not. If all you want is just to get people to be predictable, you can activate people emotionally. More complex behaviors are much harder to get, obviously, but the simple behavior of just getting angry and yelling at the next person, or clicking on another video in the list, that's actually pretty easy behavior to get. And if you figured out a way to monetize that, well, that is a business model that will pour money into your pocket, but actually will destroy society. And most of that effect, the sort of the architecture, the mechanisms of that effect are below the threshold of consciousness. And I think it's really unethical to be manipulating people with techniques that operate below the threshold of consciousness without telling them what you are doing and why. So anyone who uses one of Ayogo's systems is first given control over the goal objectives, saying, you tell us what your goals are, work together with your clinician in a shared decision-making kind of model to set the goals for yourself. And then we tell you, yes, what we are going to do is we're going to provide you with a set of choices that we build for you based on how we understand you, to try to guide you towards the goals that you've told us you want. And we think that's an ethical approach to behavior changing systems. I mean, there's a bit more to it than that, but that's a really important part of it. Ayogo signed the Digital Health Equity Pledge, and we're interested in not just informed consent, but also systems that are alive to the diversity of human beings and human beings' goals and ways of being in the world, to make sure that, the systems that we build are, humanistic first. And, there's things that we could accomplish, by manipulating people. And maybe even some of those might even be thought of as being socially good goals, but we think you lose your soul when you do that. And it's very important to get people's informed consent and be transparent about what you're doing.
I'm a bit curious then, from a psychology perspective, how is it that you can manipulate the audience if they know they're being manipulated?
Well, I mean, you're manipulating me right now, right? I mean, you talked me into coming onto this podcast, and, you did it by promising me some very interesting questions and an interesting conversation, and you're both very charming young men, and so here I am. You've influenced me, and that's good. That's what I wanted. I want interesting conversations. You said, hey, Michael, would you like to have a really interesting conversation about something that matters to you, that's important? And I said, yeah, hell yeah. I'll take that 11 times out of 10. And, that was a conversation between you and I as equals. where we each had access to equivalent information, and you didn't try to do anything, underhanded to make me behave the way that you wanted. That's the kind of relationship that we want to have with all the end users of our systems, whether they're patients or clinicians.
I'm glad you guys.
So I guess in terms of, you've answered the question about the ethics of, behavioral change overall, but how do you deal with the ramifications or the interactions between healthcare's very tight policies around data gathering and what you do? Because without ongoing gathering of data, you can't really change your algorithm to improve it and make sure that it better fits the patient hand. But at the same time, trying to get data out of healthcare systems or healthcare practices is like pulling teeth, rightly so.
Sure, yeah. Well, I mean, maybe even harder than pulling teeth, let's hope, for certain kinds of data. Yeah, well, I mean, we're just a company operating in the world, we're just a cork bobbing on the waves of this big ocean. There are things that are best done by industry, innovating and building things and being driven by, the profit motive. We're a for-profit company. Profit motive drives a lot of big human behavior. It drives our behavior and creates incentives for us. And there are things that should definitely not be left to industry. And because the profit motive has no place there, it's the space of governments and foundations and nonprofits. And one of those things is regulatory regimes. I think that industry cannot be trusted to self-regulate here. There's too much money, and it's just going to drive people's behavior. And it already has driven people's behavior in all kinds of awful ways. So we're big fans of, even though it constrains our business and makes our life harder, in so many ways, it would just be so easy if we could just do unethical things, right? But, GDPR has been really good. HIPAA is a great start. PIPEDA here in Canada. I mean, these regulatory frameworks are important. And I think it's important that we push as individual citizens, not just as business people, that, and as clinicians and engineers and, and all the people, as society, that we push our governments to ensure that we have regulatory regimes that are well informed by the current state of technology, but also the values of our society. And, Ayogo our job is to live within that. And where we see the regulations fall short, we can set an example. We can work together with other companies and try to be an exemplar. But we don't see it as our job to make other people do things any particular way. I mean, we're just trying to live the best way that we know how and feel good about ourselves and go to bed at night. And if the regulations are ahead of us, then that's great. We've got a target to go to. And if the regulations are behind us, well, that's unfortunate, but that doesn't keep us from the obligation that I feel, and everybody at Ayogo feels, I know, to live our values.
That's fascinating that you mentioned that, because in offline, we talked about how a lot of Ayogo's work is non-shreddable. And for those listeners who don't know what shred is, it's basically a tax credit that incentivizes, if I'm not incorrect, Michael, innovation R&D, essentially. But it seems like behavioral change doesn't seem to fall within the purview of that, of that field.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is? And do you think this will impede the growth of the digital health sector, which I guess ultimately often will aim to incentivize behavioral change to increase adherence to certain therapeutics?
Yes, well, I think it does, clearly. I mean, this is obviously an example where it's interesting that it's actually not in the statute, right? It's not in the legislation or regulatory framework of SR&ED, scientific research and experimental development, SR&ED tax credits. It's actually a policy of the CRA. And I think that policy has been in place for a long time, and it actually is not serving us very well now. And the policy is that social sciences are not shreddable. So any innovation or scientific research you do in social sciences, and, from our point of view, human psychology and behavior change is kind of the key piece there for us, is not shreddable at all. And despite the fact we're doing, we think, really, real important experimental development. We're not a scientific research organization. We think there is important scientific research to be done here. But from an experimental development point of view, this is where we spend all day, every day, is doing experimental development in this area. And none of it is shreddable. That has cost us several $1 million over the last few years. And, relative to companies in other areas, and it is driving innovation away from our space and into other spaces. On the one hand, if you want to, remain an independent company, and on the other hand, it's driving us to take U.S. venture capital and lose control of our companies earlier because we have to raise more money. I think it is not a healthy dynamic, and I think that CRA needs to do something about it. But again, we're just a small company, and there's only so much that we can do. I've done everything I can to raise this issue with every politician, every legislator, every regulator I speak to. I mentioned it at some point. Sort of getting a reputation as being the thread complainer, but
Sure guy.
But I do think it's important. And it's just an example, just to your earlier point, it's just an example of how, we can let the regulations fall behind the current state of the art. And we need to always be working to make sure that we're keeping things up to date.
To push back against you then, Michael, why do you think these regulations were in place to begin with?
Well, yeah, I think it's for good reasons. I think, I expect that the reason that it was done in the first place was to try to avoid things like, advertising systems and stuff like that, marketing programs, being threadable. I think, I don't doubt that there were very well-meaning people who put these policies in place for very good reasons. It just, at this point, it is completely impenetrable. The CRA is impenetrable at the best of times. And somewhere inside CRA, there's some council of people who's making decisions, and I have no way of speaking to them. I don't know if they've ever heard this message from me, and there's no way there appears to be no good way to influence it except to go in through the political side, which seems like a pretty blunt instrument if you're a company that's trying to, work in 6, 12, 18-month innovation cycles. So, again, there's only so much a company our size can do, but I think, I hope that, here in Canada, generally, we can get better at evolving our policies more quickly than, it's an opportunity for Canada, frankly, to be a leader in thinking about how our legislation and our regulatory frameworks better reflect our values and goals as a society. And hopefully we can avoid some of the scenes that we've seen south of the border with senators asking just absurdly stupid questions of religion executives. And, I'm not a full technocrat. I don't think we should just turn our legislation over to to researchers and academics, but I do think that there's a need here for politicians and regulators to listen to experts in the field.
To move away from politics for a second, let's take it back to the company. What is no one likes politics? No one likes politics. Let's the reverse. Okay. What's Ayogo's 5-year plan? What are you guys working on?
Well, we are working hard to transform the way that patients transition from, late stage kidney disease to renal failure. There's a lot that happens in that time that's very difficult and challenging. And we really believe we can make a real difference in people's lives, people that are struggling. Something like 60% of all patients with stage 4 kidney disease have a crash or unplanned start on dialysis. That is a really awful, horrifying statistic, and we really should do something about it. And I think, there's lots of people who can play a part in that, but Ayogo, we feel this is really at the heart of our expertise. It is helping people make these transitions, to be ready for them, to think them through carefully, to engage with their clinicians, share decision-making processes, and establish a common language for talking about what healthcare goals, clinical goals, your care plan can match up together with your life plan. And beyond renal care, we're thinking about, other therapeutic areas that we can travel to next. There's a lot of really interesting use cases, we think, and in multiple sclerosis and conditions like that. So, we're doing our early stage research there to to think about our next generation of product.
That's certainly fascinating. And I mean, as someone who speaks from the healthcare side, I'm really wondering, what can healthcare providers or people who are advocates for the adoption and use of ancillary like behavioral modification technologies or digital health technologies do to help advance the adoption of tools which can improve patient outcomes despite pushback from within?
Hmm. Well, I mean, I, I hate to push more responsibility onto physicians, right? Because there's so much to be done there, and you're expected to be an expert in so many things all the time. And, now, just in the last 15, 20 years, a whole new era of technology was, kind of foisted on, on people. Some of that obviously has been to very, very good effect and made practice easier and better in a lot of ways. And some of it has not. Some of it has really just been, made things more difficult, more systems you have to interact with, more user interfaces. You have to be an expert in technology in a way that you didn't have to maybe 20 years ago. But I do think that there's a need here for a kind of the next generation of physicians, and not just doctors, but also nurses and this allied care professionals, to recognize that we live in a technological environment. Everything that we're doing is connected online. Everything's network connected. Everyone's got a supercomputer in their pocket now. And this is, this is the world that we live in. And, medical practice and, nursing care and, just like technology development, 20 years before, has to adapt. And we need to do different things now and think differently about our role here. I think industry has got an important responsibility here to not just toss half-baked crap, frankly, over the wall to physicians and say, you guys figure it out. That is totally the wrong way to do it. We need, good, industry validation, regulatory frameworks. There's a whole bunch of stuff we need to do to make sure that the digital therapeutics and the digital solutions that we're delivering into the healthcare system are properly validated and are designed well. It's not just about clinical validation, but also about user acceptance testing and experience design validation. If we can do those things well, then we can put good tools in the hands of the healthcare professionals, who are ultimately the ones that are responsible for the care of the patients, right? You have to put good tools in their hand. And with those tools, I think there's a real role and a key role for the clinicians to play here to guide their patients towards a better, healthier relationship with their care and the data that their care is generating, right? Most healthcare is data driven in a way that patients don't see because it's kind of hidden inside the EMR, or it's off in the cloud somewhere. But, we need to make sure that patients understand that, it's not just about the explicit choices you're making and the things that you do, that there's this sort of digital fingerprint that you have everywhere. And it's actually an important part of your healthcare. You need to understand what it is and how it works and how to properly utilize it to get to your health goals as a patient.
So on the flip side of that, I mean, you just talked about patients and healthcare providers, but what can technical experts like yourself, or those who are, more T-shaped, as you said, do to help advance the field of digital therapeutics and the adoption of these tools?
Yeah, well, so, okay, I don't want to get political right away with your question, but I do think that there's something important to say about it, right? Which is that we need to change the way that we think about success, from an industry point of view. And it's not just about making money. I mean, there are plenty of things that make money that are actually terrible. And, I was just having this conversation with somebody about homeopathy. I mean, if the only measure of your success is, does it make money? Then I guess homeopathy is a huge success, but we know that it's complete garbage. And in fact, for the most part, gets in the way of people doing the things that they actually really need to do to be healthy, right? It's actually bad for many people who avoid engaging with real therapies in favor of the pseudoscience. So it's important, from an engineering and a technical and business point of view, that we are not just thinking like, does this thing work the way I designed it? Or does this thing make money? But also, does this increase human flourishing? That's actually the real measure of our success. And, we need to bring that lens to everything that we're doing, from engineering to experience design, to business model creation. And I think that it's especially incumbent on the part of the people in this picture, the stakeholders that are coming from the business and technology side we're not used to, none of us have taken a Hippocratic oath. It's something that's very in the healthcare side. My wife's a nurse, and I know a lot of people who are healthcare professionals. It's just second nature to them. Yeah, of course, my job is human flourishing. That's what I do, right? But that's something that we have to adopt more. We have to be more explicit about it on the technical and business side of this sort of stakeholder table, so that we can properly engage in the conversation in the right way.
That was a beautiful answer. I really enjoyed that. To close off, I'd like to just ask you a very simple question. What advice would you give your 15, 16-year-old self, since you've had such a different journey?
Wow. Well, when you meet that beautiful young woman in Prince George, definitely accept her offer wearing her sweater in front of the campfire, even though it's too small for you. You'll look silly, but you'll thank me later. That's the first piece of advice. I would say, stay curious. That every success you're going to have in your life is built from some combination of curiosity and love and diligence. When you work hard and you're curious and you have love in your heart, everything you do is good. So just focus on those things, and everything's going to work out for you. That'll be my advice.
Last thing, are there any pluggables that you'd like to plug? Any social media profiles, LinkedIn, etc.?
Well, sure. So for those people out there whose backgrounds are, healthcare or technology, or interested in industry, we're pretty sort of inside out company. We publish a lot of our sort of internal culture stuff gets published onto Instagram and Facebook. That's one good way to find our company there and see what it's like to be us. And if you're interested in the work that we're doing from a sort of customer facing point of view, you can find us on LinkedIn. Company is called Ayogo, Ayogo, and ayogo.com. And of course, anyone out there should feel free to reach out to me directly on LinkedIn, Michael Fergusson, 2 S's in Ferguson. And I just love to hear from, new people and love to hear what people are working on that's interesting.